It is July 28th, and you are listening to the Living Youth Podcast. And Mr. Robinson and I have some wonderful guests here. Mystery guests, unless you read the title. And I suspect most of you did, but let's pretend you didn't. Say hello, mystery guests.
Hello.
Hello. And thank you for inviting us.
Oh, look
It's
at
our
that.
privilege.
We got bonus words. All right. We're going to jump into this year's camp, what went down this summer, how things went. And we'll be hearing from Mr. Weston and Mr. McNair as they give us the scoop. Thank you, Jake and Julia, as always. And again, welcome to the Living Youth Podcast. We know some of you listening to this, hopefully you're rested. A lot of you actually were at the camp we're going to be discussing here in the podcast, and hope you've gotten some good sleep, some recovery time, and your brain is filled with happy memories. And we hope that if you haven't had the opportunity yet, if you were at camp, you didn't get the opportunity, that you're heading out to livingyouth.org and looking at the pictures that we've posted for you guys. All of us who were not at camp definitely appreciated hearing some tales and such. Mr. Robinson, I'm sure you did. Was it nice to hear some good news every once in a while?
I didn't have anyone return from camp, so I don't have the inside scoop or stories from camp.
We did. Folks came home. My wife was there and three of the boys, and they, on one hand, you could tell they had a lot to say. On the other hand, they were pooped. They were really tired, and so everyone was looking at an early bedtime that night. But we do have two guests with us who were there the whole time. We have Mr. Gerald Weston, presiding evangelist of the Living Church of God, who directed the camp. And we have Mr. Jonathan McNair, who heads Living Education and was indispensable there at the camp. And they have been kind enough, only finding out yesterday that we wanted to do this, to sit down with us today and to talk about camp. So howdy, fellas. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you.
Before we get into the serious questions, let me ask, do you feel like you have recovered from camp? It's only been a day or two since you've been back. How are you feeling?
Well, I could certainly use a cup of coffee right about now.
He tried very hard, listeners, to get some coffee. Both pots were empty, so he's. If you start to hear some snoring, we'll know where it comes from. We'll have to forgive him. Mr. Nair, how you feeling?
The only reason I'm actually cogent here is because I just finished off an iced coffee from Panera's, and once I hit the bottom there, I'm in a bit of a fog, but still able to function.
Wow. This is going to be that much more a fun podcast, I think, knowing all of that. All right. We do have some questions that we would like to ask, and by all means, y'all feel free and jump in. If they're not directed to any one, well, I think a few of the questions might be directed to one of you, but feel free and jump in and let people know what we think, and we'll do our best to stand back and just listen to you guys. Mr. Robinson, I think you have the first question.
I do. We didn't want to miss an opportunity of you guys coming back from camp and it being fresh on your mind to ask you about it for our listeners out there. And while Mr. Smith and I are fairly familiar with each of your backgrounds in the camp, we thought we might take a moment for each of you to briefly discuss some of your camp experience and backgrounds for the listeners who just aren't familiar with it. I thought maybe we could start with you, Mr. Weston.
Well, I've always enjoyed camp as a young person. When we went camping, it was camping. It wasn't in dorms or anything like that. It was on the ground usually. But my first experience with camping was in 1983 with the Worldwide Church of God, the summer education program. And then I came back in 86 and continued to work in the camp from then on all the way to 1999, and thought it was a good time to retire. So that was my experience working at a number of camps, the one in Minnesota, also in Texas, and North Carolina. Missouri was our first one for this organization, and now in Texas.
How about you, Mr. McNair?
My first camp experience was when I was 16. Went as a camper to SCP up in Orr, Minnesota. Had a great time, really enjoyed it. Was able to go back as a counselor some years later when I was in college, and was also able to do a few other camp experiences. I was able to be part of the SCP on Wheels in New Zealand, and that was, I have to say, still that was my favorite camp experience, I think, bar none, because it was a 500-mile bike trip across the South Island of New Zealand, and it was just an awesome experience. I was able to also be a counselor 1 year in Australia, and also served in the Philippines at the camp that they had there for 1 year when we lived overseas in Asia. So those are experiences that then led to the opportunity later to work with Mr. Weston with the camp back in Global, then later in Living days. So really had the opportunity to have a lot of different experiences, which I find helpful just in terms of background and grasping how to try to adapt to whatever conditions you have. It's been very helpful to have those in the back of my mind as we go forward. So.
Wow, it's hard for me to fathom me ever using the words 500-mile bike trip or whatever that was and favorite, camp experience in the same breath. So given that, I know from my perspective, I'm so gracious. Y'all invited me to be a part of the camp program, way back, and I started with the Preteen Camp Missouri, and I appreciated it, but I am not a camp-oriented person. I don't like bugs. I don't like dirt. I don't necessarily like being outside, very inside-oriented person, but did appreciate being a part of that. And now so busy, I will freely admit, it was very different. It was nice being here and getting some things done and some air conditioning and hearing tales of your 105-degree, 106-degree days. But Mr. Weston in particular, thinking of you, you're the presiding evangelist of the church. Not sure if you're aware, if that's a surprise today. You're the presiding evangelist of the church, and I know your time is very full because we try to keep that in mind if we're ever asking you for a meeting. Even today, we try to keep your schedule in mind. I know there's a lot of demands on your time. You're very busy, and yet for the last 2 years, this year and last year, you felt it was important for you to be there, that it was worth 2 whole weeks of your time, even more when it comes to some of the planning and such. Why is that? What is it about the camp program that makes it stand out as something worth your time in that regard?
I like to use the analogy of a pebble thrown into water or lake, and how concentric circles come out from that, little waves. And each person that you affect in a positive way has an effect on others around him or her. And the camp was beginning to go in a direction that we did not feel it needed to go or was profitable for it to go. So we're trying to really recapture the true values that we started, that Mr. McNair and I worked at, and there were others. We weren't the only ones, especially up in Michigan where we had the teen camp there. And those values include being inclusive, where you have everybody involved, not just those who are athletes or those who are popular, but we want to be concerned for all of the campers and make sure that all the campers are included in everything. So we have programs, Mr. McNair calls them mechanisms, and I'll use that for lack of a better term at the moment, such as eating in the dining hall, a very simple thing where we have assigned seating in the sense that we take 2 dorms in and they at random and mix them up, and they have the opportunity to meet somebody different, somebody new each time they go to a meal. That's 3 times a day. And that's very different from letting everybody choose wherever they want to sit, because then that mechanism causes them to clique up, or click up, as some of our young people like to say. It's actually a French word, but I just say that because I was corrected on that by a young person some years ago. But click up or clique up, whichever way you want to say it. And so we want to get them to think about the other person. We want to cut down on the cool factor, where everybody's trying to out-cool everybody else, and essentially say, look at me, I'm somebody. And when that's the case, they're thinking about themselves, himself, herself, instead of the other people. And we want our young people to learn to think about other people, because that's a godly way of life, and it's learned early on. And so it's very important to us to have this program going in the right direction. And so when they come as campers, later on as high school workers, then adult workers and counselors, and then they go to our Living for Tomorrow program, 18 to 30 years of age. We reinforce these values, and then we have a few a small number, a handful number, a couple handful of people that come to our living education program. And that gives us the opportunity, again, to try to mold them into a direction that is going to spread out throughout the whole church and build profitable families, marriages and families, and leaders for tomorrow.
So some of the results we won't even really see or feel the full impact of for several years as you're
That's
getting
correct.
the process started. You know, when you first started off and used the word inclusive, I was a little worried where you were going with this camp culture.
That word really has changed, hasn't it, in recent years? Yeah.
Well, with that in mind, you already touched on that. I thought I might ask Mr. McNair if, this is your second year since you were there before, getting back into the camp culture and establishing things. Did you have a primary goal or focus that you had coming to camp this year, or really you just have, you clearly have in mind what you're trying to get done, and there's a series of things?
I think the principles that Mr. Weston is enunciating, and there are others that we put into effect. They're so important, not just to talk about them, but this is what fascinates me about camp, and I become very passionate. I can become almost fixated on it. Is how do we make those principles come alive in those 2 weeks when the campers are there? Really principles that should reinforce what they're learning at home, what their parents are teaching them, but in an atmosphere with other kids, with other young people, and where they're having fun, they're doing activities. But how can we make those principles truly come alive? And some of that has to do with a system that we build so that they're literally doing things that reinforce those principles, as Mr. Weston was talking about, for example, in the dining hall, or throughout the course of the day. But having traditions that we talk about and that we teach that create that environment, and so I think, to me, that's the most exciting thing. In addition to the fact that now we have the opportunity with now that I'm involved with living education, I have the opportunity to look at the future that we have in as far as potential for living education. Some of the kids that we can encourage to be able to be part of the program. It's the opportunity to plant that seed that this is something they could be involved in years to come. So that's a bit of a side benefit.
I was going to ask, did you find you had opportunity to encourage and talk about living education over the course of camp?
I guess in one way, I'm not a very good salesman, because I love doing and building the program, and I'm not. I guess it's just not my nature to be talking about it necessarily all the time. But by being able to show the video we did and being able to talk about it with campers when it's reasonable, when it doesn't seem like I'm just a used car salesman or something, just trying to promote our program. Yeah, definitely. And I think what happens is you see kids who have they have that spark and they want to learn and they want to be part of the program, and those are the kids you can say, hey, you know what, you do well living education. Not that they're all not going to be part of the program, but anyway, it gives a chance to get to know kids and look to the future of our other programs that we do.
Right. What you said reminds me of something Ryan Dawson told me a long time ago. He and I went on a trip to a different congregation. I think he had the sermonette and I was giving the sermon, and he reflected back on Michigan and said that camp, for a young person, it was one of the first times it clicked in his mind, the church loves me. Not just, the church actually is investing in me. And among the things we talked about, camp gives you so many opportunities to interact with the teenagers just on a level you don't normally get to. You're sitting and eating with them and you're talking with them. And I imagine it would hopefully give you more natural opportunities to talk about some of those things with them. So it's not just the church making a pitch, but it's you talking with someone in particular, hearing about what's going on in their life, and maybe even talking with them about why they may want to consider, things like living education.
We would hope that while it's important for them to develop relationships with other teenagers while they're there, we would hope that it would also encourage them to build relationships with other adults who could be mentors and encouragers in their life, And so that's why the programs that we do and the activities we do are not all about just providing fun for the kids, but they're actually about helping them to build, to grow, to develop excellence in different ways they can, but also to strengthen the fabric between them and other adults within the church who are engaged and involved. So we're serving them, but we're not just waiting hand on foot on them to try to provide entertainment, but we're actually trying to build and encourage them in a much more important way that's deeper than that.
We're very upfront with the campers. We tell them, or at least I tell them, that we have something to sell them. And what we have to sell them is a better way of life. And that better way of life is not the sports programs that we have. And we do have sports programs, and some people think, well, we're not interested in sports. Yes, we are. I played sports all my life growing up. And I think sports are very important, that young people learn things. But that's not what we're trying to sell them. They can find that a lot of different places. What we're trying to sell them is caring for one another and including others in their lives and giving of themselves. And we want them to give back to one another, give to the church, not just to receive, because when you receive something all the time and you cease to receive it, then you go someplace else. But as long as you are involved and you are giving to the program themselves, well, then they learn to love it. We had many young people this year who have tremendous talent in music, and not only in piano and violin and singing. We had a large choir, I think the best choir I've ever heard at a Living Youth Camp or any of our teen camps throughout the years. But you have to teach them something besides just sports or just activities. There's far more that we're trying to teach them, and it's a way of life. And that way of life was exemplified by what Mr. Armstrong said: there's a way of give and there's a way of get. And we want to teach them the way of give.
There's a really neat component that we've begun to rejuvenate in camp, and I think it's exciting to see how it's working. That's the high school program, the high school worker program. We call it different things, but basically it's an interim between campers and full staff, and we really phrase it that way. And there's a reason, because of what Mr. Weston is talking about. That's this concept of being able to serve and give to others. When you're a camper, okay, you can do it in different ways in your dorm, but when you become a high school worker, we really encourage them to make that transition in their mind that now, yes, they're there, they can do whatever activity they're doing, they can have fun with it, but they are now in a role of serving their younger brothers and sisters, helping them to really succeed, as opposed to coming to camp for themselves, just only for themselves. And,
right.
And that's hard. That's a hard corner to turn, but it's really neat, because we're able to see some of them catch the vision as they're in camp, and you can see the light come on their eyes that, this is actually fun. This is enjoyable. This feels good to be able to help others. And they may not have even actually come with that in mind, but when they get there and they participate in that way, they begin to catch that vision, and that really helps them to lay the groundwork for them to be a really effective staff member in years to come.
Right.
And that's very biblical, as Christ said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And some people really catch that vision, and they do enjoy it.
You know, I know when I was in St. Louis, we had several young men, in fact, one who's here, Ben Graham, right across the hall, going to camp and being exposed to a lot of these principles. And I would imagine what you're saying about the high school staff position, you have campers that are kind of learning to be a part, learning to absorb the culture. But then in that, you teach them to serve in a way that maybe when they get back to their congregations,
Sure.
maybe they're more interested in pitching in and contributing in some way, and seeing that there's a value to that's been emphasized to them.
When if they continue that track and they can come back as counselors, which we always need, because that's a fairly narrow age group there. Counselors, they work hard. I mean, they are 24/7 with the kids, and if you don't have a heart to serve your younger brother and sister as a counselor, you will not succeed. And so the hope is that some of these high school workers will enjoy that, and will recognize how fulfilling it is. and then they can be campers. I mean, they can be counselors, I should say. And they need that mindset, because our counselors, just imagine having 18 teenagers that you're responsible for to encourage and help through the day. It's not an easy task.
The boys would, over the years they've known and they've commented. I appreciate how they put it, but they've had counselors in the past where you could tell there was the young man who's more interested in the opportunity to be the kind of big man on campus, like, oh, look at me, I'm a counselor, and look at all the things I can do. But then those that were really interested in serving them and helping them throw the ball better, helping them overcome their concerns about speech class. And yeah, that's a really, I can imagine that's something you'd be concerned about. The principles involved, while y'all were at camp, Mr. Weston, you did one of your Friday night videos, updates to the church, and at services the next day, one of the parents who no longer has children in the camp, they've grown, but she had some in the camp way back before, and she stopped me and grabbed me, was so excited. She goes, "Oh, Mr. Smith, everything Mr. Weston said last night. I'm so excited they're talking about those things at camp." So you go and you have these great principles, but then camp and its circumstances, its environment can have surprises for you. And that was one thing we did want to ask you about today. What were some of the challenges you faced this year? I know at the old Missouri preteen camp another time, it seems like every year it's a new set of challenges. You think you mastered one year and the next year offers you more. Surely this year, and I could guess at some of them, offered you some particular challenges this year. What were some of the challenges you had to face with this particular year of camp in Texas?
Well, I think the one that was on the minds of a lot of people is this pandemic that's been going on for a long time. It's had some consequences. A lot of our campers have been locked up for a couple of years and haven't been out involved in athletics and sports, and so we had a lot of young people that wanted to learn things, but also we had to face the problem of COVID as well at the camp itself. And we went into it with the mindset that we would not shut down the camp this year. We think it was the right decision last year because of it was a much more severe strain of it. This year it was much milder. We didn't have our first case that we knew of until really the second week, and by the end of camp everybody was healthy and on his or her feet again. So we worked through it as we planned, and we had the nurse and we consulted with the doctor on certain things, but that was a challenge because we didn't know exactly how that would play out. But we had usually 3 to 6 people in quarantine any given day, and 2 would go in and 3 would come out, and that's kind of the way that it went all the way through.
Probably the second biggest challenge is another physical challenge was the heat. I got to the point where I was really thinking to suggest to Mr. Weston that we need to have activities either in the water or in the air condition. And apart from that,
or both at the same time.
Or both, because it was so hot. It was really, so we could go from canoeing to swimming, back to the water skiing, and then in the cool gym, and but thankfully I had the foresight to bring my bicycle. And I kept telling Mr. Weston, you need to have a moped, or you can borrow my bicycle if you'd like, because when you get on the bicycle and the wind is going past you, it was just really pleasant. But he kept saying he wanted to walk and get exercise. I offered him actually to ride along with me on my bike, but the seat was really just not large enough for more than one person. But I keep trying to convince him next year. I think he needs to get a moped.
A little electric scooter, maybe.
He could have stood. I've seen people like in other countries standing on the back spokes or something like that, or on the axle.
Yeah.
As long as we get a picture of that, that would be great.
Yeah, one of the things we did, we adjusted as we went through, and we took a fellowship time in the middle of the day. We had a rest period scheduled in, but we had fellowship time as well, and we combined those and just sent them back to get some rest. They needed the rest, and you could tell after a couple days of doing that it made a big difference.
You can tell a big difference between the first and the second week with the kids and the energy levels. So it always really lagged. Where did you put the fellowship time?
We experimented around. There was a new amphitheater behind the dining hall. The problem is that there's not a lot of shade there. And also that concrete, it was all concrete, would heat up quite a bit and just radiate that heat. There was a sprinkler that could be used to cool it down. But we also had it over by the administration building, and we even had one time where we went up, or a couple times where we went up to what was called a playground area.
I know my wife was there, and some of the boys, like I mentioned, and several of them commented that when you had to change the fellowship time to rest and recuperation, there was some sadness at first, because the campers really enjoy fellowship time. They enjoy that time to get to mix and mingle, but then they started to enjoy the benefits of having that break, and it really started to make a difference in terms of their energy levels and the attitude. And so I know my wife commented on being able to see the shift, that the kids quickly understood, no, we're really glad they made this call. We missed the fellowship time, but this is nice. We need this break.
We might want to explain what fellowship time is to those who are uninitiated. It's not free time. It's a time where they are all together in a location that's confined, and they have the opportunity to just mix and mingle and get to know one another. And that was something that has traditionally been a very popular activity at camp. You'd think of all the busy things, but they just want to spend some time together.
I'd like to throw in some kudos for our staff. We mentioned having to adjust and modify because of the heat, and that's one thing that I always appreciate, is that our staff is willing to go with us, willing to make the adjustments and change, even though sometimes it actually throws a curve to them in terms of food preparation or in terms of classes. But that's the beauty of the situation we have there at camp, where we have volunteers who are willing to adapt and willing to follow and cooperate, and that's the only way we could make changes like that to accommodate these different challenges that we face.
So a shout out to the staff for being so supportive and making it work.
It's the only way it can really happen like that. Sometimes we have to do it on the fly. Sometimes everybody doesn't find out when we do something, and they have to just adapt, and then we work it out. But that's important in terms of being able to make changes like that.
You reminded me of something about fellowship time, since you did mention, of course, probably most of the people listening haven't had the opportunity to be there yet. That was something I noticed that y'all made sure was not present during fellowship time last year, and I'm sure this year as well, is you did make sure there were Frisbees and footballs and other things, because sure enough, and in my experience, even at the preteen camp, if there was a ball, well, then people would just start doing that. And next thing you know, they're not really getting to know each other anymore. You got the guys that want to throw the football, and everybody try to catch it. And next thing you know, a week has passed, and they really haven't been in a situation where they have to talk to somebody else and get to know. And it's not that the kids don't enjoy that time. Universally, they love that opportunity. And sometimes it's interesting. You kind of need to remove some options sometimes to increase the happiness and what someone gets out of it.
You probably have to be creative, though. You put three boys together, and they're standing still for like 1 minute. They'll find a pine cone to start throwing around.
Yeah, so some of them were building an ant farm, and prison, I guess it was. I mean, they were doing some serious excavation there. You're exactly right.
Well, Mr. McNair, you actually mentioned something that was the next question that we wanted to ask, which was, you talked about what a blessing it was that the staff was so flexible and went along with you. Was there anything else that really stood out this year that was a real blessing? And I'm surprised how often something is that I would consider somewhat ironic is a blessing. It's like, well, it was real hot, but at least we had the blessing of the big air-conditioned gym, which is so flexible that you can do a lot of events in there. But was there anything that stood out as like, wow, we really felt blessed about this, that, or the other?
One thing I'm thinking as you're mentioning this, and Mr. Weston is thinking, I can see we're both thinking about this, where to begin. Maybe this is a bit out of left field, but one blessing was that we had a number of people, particularly ministers, who had never been, or I say never been to camp before. Some of them may have been in years gone by, but hadn't had the opportunity for a long time. Mr. Bill Long, he went to SCP, but he'd never been to one of our camp programs. Mr. Bueno. I think, again, he may have been involved maybe in a preteen camp or something some years ago, but
He was one of my assistant counselors one
okay,
year.
and
Texas
Missouri-
preteen.
Texas. So it had been years since he had been involved, and right down the list there were a number who hadn't been involved, and I think that added an extra energy because they were really happy to be there and to give what they could. So that was, maybe again, that's out of left field, but I thought that was a real blessing that made a big impact.
I think that overwhelmingly, our staff was really on board with the direction that we want to go, and that was so important. You have to have staff that understand what you're trying to do. We had staff that were there maybe years ago, and they had been to other camps in the meantime, and they were very appreciative of the direction things were going, and that was very gratifying to hear that. We also had at least 18 children of former campers from the Michigan camp.
It's so important. I just would want to follow up on what Mr. Weston was saying. If staff listen politely when you're speaking and when we're talking about the principles that we're trying to implement, they listen politely, but then they go and do their own thing when it comes to their area, their activity. What happens is it undermines everything, and it becomes confusing because campers don't realize, well, what's the real message here? But when you have staff who literally embrace what you're trying to teach, and they say yes, and they actually then can expand on it and really encourage the campers in their area, it just creates a whole atmosphere that really teaches the lessons we're trying to teach. And so it's really important that staff aren't just agreeable, but are truly enthused about
Fully
the
on
principles.
board with what you're trying to do.
Yeah, it makes all the difference in the world. So that was really encouraging to see.
Yeah, I remember being on your staff and feeling the appropriate pressure for you guys to say, hey, we're expecting the kids to check in on each other. If they see someone alone, go be with them so they're not alone. But they're only going to do what you do as staff. You need to be doing the same thing. It actually reminded me of a scripture. This is a Bible oriented podcast we have, but in Judges chapter 5, the song of Deborah and Barak, where it says there in verse 2, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the eternal. It really takes both sides of that formula to work. And it sounds like what you're saying is that you really felt with the staff, you did have individuals willingly offering themselves. One of the things I also wanted to ask was, and it is neat to be able to see this, it doesn't always happen so starkly, but especially with a group this large, you have a chance to see some campers come at the beginning, and maybe they're nervous, maybe it's their first time, or maybe they're not, but regardless, you've got people at the beginning, and then you have 2 weeks later, and then you see these kids on their way. Were there any examples this year where you saw something be different for a camper? I remember teaching speech all the time. You'd have kids that were terrified of speaking in front of anyone. They wouldn't want to even give a speech if no one else were in the room. And to see them sort of overcome those things, by the time you're done, was always just really encouraging. This year, do you have any memories of any campers that even, we know you're planting seeds that make a difference over time, but even in just that 2 weeks, did you have the opportunity to maybe see some campers maybe grow in some kind of way or learn something they hadn't?
Looks like you may have something in your mind, but maybe I could make a comment, Mr. Weston, on generally speaking, because I'm going through all the counselor reviews of their campers. Mm-hmm. We asked that they would fill out a form. It's fairly simple, just basically a list of characteristics and qualities and how their campers did, and they can have a place they comment. And there are quite a few that talk about that, who say, this camper was very quiet at the beginning, and they were very shy, they were afraid to be there, but as the camp went on, they began to blossom, and they show maybe very young, maybe a 13 or 14-year-old, they show the makings of being a really good camper leader next year. So that's on my mind as you ask that question, because I've just been going through some of those this morning. So that really speaks to what you're saying. The counselors, I think, really see that, even so perhaps more than we do, because we're not necessarily with each camper so closely.
Right.
I'm not sure if you have a thought about that, Mr. Weston.
Well, it certainly does make a difference for some campers, especially. You know, there are going to be young people that are going to do just fine. They'll stay in the church, they'll be successful in life. And then there are those that no matter what you do, you're probably not going to change them that much. But there's that huge chunk in the middle that just need to be pushed one way or the other. They're on a tipping point. I received a letter while I was there from a former camper going back to the 1990s.
Oh, wow.
And what it was, this young lady was, and she's an adult now and married, and she was cleaning out some things and found a letter that she had written. I don't know if I received it back in what was it? I don't remember the exact year, but for an assignment, she had to write a letter to someone. And she wrote the letter to me. Again, I don't know that she ever sent it, but she did send it this year. And it was talking about how camp had changed her life, just totally turned around, that she realized that the church did care and that there were people that did care. And I don't remember all the details of the letter, but it was very encouraging to see someone from the past, someone that I know today, who had written a letter way back when she was a camper or shortly thereafter, and how it had changed her life. And for some people, it does make a huge difference.
We have some campers that come and they're not familiar with one particular skill or another, for swimming, for example. And they actually, by how hard they work to try to pass the swim test or do certain skills, they become an inspiration to the rest of the dorm, and even a point of galvanizing the dorm, because now as they're trying, they try hard. I have one example I'm thinking of in my mind this year of a young lady who really put her all into passing the swim test, and then wasn't able to the first time she took it, and then she wanted to do it again, and she did it, and it was really challenging, and she just struggled, but the counselor and the counselors and the staff members really encouraged her, and then before long the whole dorm was cheering her on, and when she got to the end of the pool, the whole dorm virtually carried her off the field if there would have been a field, because they were so excited for her. Well, that type of thing, apart from the swimming, that type of thing is encouraging both ways, because it's encouraging to a teen to see that people care about her, and that's really encouraging, that to have a moment like that. It's also encouraging on the point of the rest of the dorm, because they taste what it feels like to take joy in someone else's success, and that's golden. I mean, that's precious, really.
I hadn't really thought about it before, but like camp is actually this ideal mixture made up of many individuals, but you also have the group dynamic be a critical part of it. And so, right there, individually that was great for that one camper, but also collectively as the group, it was an amazing experience.
We really appreciate both you guys being willing to do this, especially throwing it at you relatively spur of the moment yesterday. Is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners with? The people who listen, it's a mixture of teens. Some have been to camp, some haven't been to camp. Of course, families and parents there, and some of the young adults. Is there a particular takeaway you'd like them to take away from listening to the podcast today?
I'll go ahead and let Mr. Weston have the last word. I would just say those that are listening, I'm going to assume many of them are campers, and so I'm going to say to those who are campers, we have take great joy in being able to have the camp program, and I think that for the church to be able to position the resources and be able to provide this, I think it's a wonderful thing, especially to those who have the expectation to come and actually begin to think of other kids and begin to want to learn about other kids and reach out to other kids, and come with that mindset, as opposed to showing off or pointing attention to themselves. Some kids who are of that mindset, they'll come and they'll learn, they'll realize there's a better way. But those who, that's what life is all about, they're not going to be so happy. But I think that's the few, honestly. I think that's just the minority. Most kids, if they come, they'll savor it and they'll enjoy it and they'll build friendships for life and they'll learn some skills too. I think that, it's always exciting to see kids come and learn a skill that allows them to be more successful in their life back home. I know my wife, she just loved working with kids in volleyball. That was her expertise, and she would be so excited when a girl would come to her because of what she learned at camp. Maybe she didn't know a lot about volleyball, but because she learned the skills to do it right, the basic skills to succeed, she was able to go back to her home and try out for the volleyball team and make it. And because of what she learned at camp.
Wow.
And so anyway, developing skills, developing people skills, those soft skills that are really part of what we train them there. It's actually fun to do those things. So to any young people who are listening, take advantage of camp and come there to really savor it and throw yourself into the whole experience, and you'll benefit. And that's what it's all about.
So come planning on doing it the way it was designed to be done, and letting it do those good things for you that it was designed to do.
At 100%. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Weston, anything in particular?
Mr. McNair takes the manager, department heads. He works with the department heads. I work with the counselors. And one of the things I tell the counselors every year is that, in fact, I tell the whole staff in our orientation. And our orientation period is extremely important. That's why we don't want campers there early, because we have to get our heads wrapped around what we're there for. But I tell them they're going to be an example, either a good example or a bad example. And they will be an example either way. And I've often told the counselors that these campers may not remember your names, but they will remember you as their counselor. I don't know how many times over the years I've had young people come up and either tell me about a good counselor or one that maybe wasn't so good, which I think is the rarity overall. But nevertheless, I'll ask, well, who was your counselor? And they don't remember the name, but 20, 30 years later, they still remember the example that was set there. And I'd just like to say one other thing. Mr. Lambert Greer made a comment that I hope, always remember. He said, what we're teaching this year at camp probably won't sink in for about 4 years. In other words, it takes time for the lessons that we are teaching to really sink in to the minds and into the behavior of young people, or anybody for that matter. And so it's very encouraging to know that, because sometimes at the end of camp, you see them getting on the bus to go with the airport or whatever, and they start posturing and doing all the things that young people do. They start going right back into junior high or high school, and you kind of feel discouraged by it. But to realize that 4 years down the road, and it may not be exactly 4 years, of course, there's going to be a difference. And I think one of the proofs of it is that when you sit down with the counselors during one of the morning counselor meetings, they'll sometimes say, these kids are really different. They're not like we were. And I kind of smile knowing that that's the way that they were. But they've understood the program, they've bought into the ideals of the program, and it's changed them. And it does make a difference.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate, again, you guys doing this. And now that we're wrapping up, I hope you'll get some rest. I hope you go home, catch some Z's. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Smith and Robinson.